The long march through the institutions has been going on, and it's knocking on the door of the American church at every turn. And it's interesting, you talked about, if these institutions fail, the family or faith, something will replace it. And really what replaces it is politics. It's like we turn politics into this almost religious endeavor and effort, which, politics is really important, but it's a false god and therefore a terrible god.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. It is going to be an outstanding conversation today. We have a friend who is an alumnus of Heritage Action, an alumnus of the first Trump term. See what I did there? And also someone who is a great friend. Sometimes we talk to people about public policy. Sometimes we talk to them about living the good life, which is sort of our informal mantra at the Heritage Enterprise. Sometimes we talk explicitly about faith, even for those of you in the audience who aren't necessarily someone who would describe yourself as a person of faith. You know that conversation is important, not just to American conservatism, but to America, period. All of that to say, today, we're talking about all of those things. So one of these wide-ranging conversations I've really been looking forward to. I am sitting here today with William Wolfe, the Executive Director of the Center for Baptist Leadership. William, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
You're a great American.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks for carving out time to sit here. And you're doing such great work. And we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about some topics that shouldn't be controversial, like the intersection of faith and politics and related issues, even some matters that are specific to your particular church, the Southern Baptist Convention. But before we do that, what's your story?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It was funny, you calling me a great American. I do appreciate that. And you are one as well. Appreciate the work that you do with the Heritage Foundation. But, just recently I was in my small town, Monroe, North Carolina, for the 4th of July, watching my 3 young boys out on the streets, watching the fireworks. And I just thought, I love this country and I want to fight for this.
Amen.
And I want them to be able to grow up in the country that I grew up in and that you grew up in. And I feel like that's tenuous right now. And so I do care about America. So my story is I'm from North Carolina and was raised by Christian parents, went to a Christian college, actually became a Christian though after college through meeting a pastor here in DC at Capital Baptist Church.
This is not a story that you hear a lot of, right?
Yeah.
Becoming Christian after college in Washington, D.C.
That's right.
Most people think the opposite happened.
That's right. Yeah, the Lord was very kind to me. And so I came here to the swamp in 2012, early 2012, to go to that church. I got a job waiting tables at P.F. Chang's up in Friendship Heights, and then got an internship on Capitol Hill for Virginia Fox. And then that just turned into a job, which turned into another job. I ended up working for 3 members of Congress, worked for Dave Brat, which was excellent.
Great friend.
People sometimes ask me, how did you get so conservative? And I say, well, I spent 2 years reading constituent mail from the 5th District of North Carolina in Virginia Fox's office as a legislative correspondent. And these are sort of like Appalachian folks, and they were not happy. And the 2 main issues, and this is in the early 2010s, the 2 main issues, immigration and trade. And so when Trump came down that escalator running on that platform, it was my time in Fox's office, my time in Dave Brat's office. I thought, this guy's going to resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, you knew that because by virtue of your job and by virtue of the member you were working for, Dr. Fox is a great friend and great member of Congress, another great American. You were close to Americans. And while you were working inside the bubble that is Washington, D.C., reading constituent letters, staying close to them, which I know actually all the members of Congress you mentioned have done, is really vital. But you touch on something that I think is something that resonates with many Americans, and that is this implication that there's something wrong, there's something broken with Washington, D.C. That's one of the things I want to get at, not just in this conversation, not just from the perspective of faith, but perhaps in addition to that very important consideration, like what can we expect about the future? Because as you told your story about being in your hometown of Monroe, North Carolina, and thinking that the country's goodness, the country's future is tenuous, that's a theme that I often talk about in this show. And I always say, I don't think that that's irreversible.
Sure.
I'm optimistic, not just because of my own faith, because I'm hopeful about Americans, but it does seem like it's pretty tenuous. So we'll touch on that. Before we launch in though, I've just got to emphasize that after you were working with the members, you came over to Heritage Action.
I did, 2016.
Yeah. And we were grateful for that great work at that pivotal time. And then a Trump administration alumnus. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I volunteered on the Presidential Transition Organization in 2016 into 2017, and then got on a list for the State Department and ended up going in doing legislative affairs at the Department of State. And then I did legislative affairs at the Department of Defense too. Some very fascinating stories I could tell. I like to tell this one. It gives you a real insight into the swamp. So in the State Department, I was one of the first political. So here I am. I'm supposed to represent the Trump administration agenda. Now, ostensibly, everybody working there is supposed to work on behalf of the duly elected chief executive of the executive branch. And but those offices are quite a mix of career, civil service, foreign service officers, politicals. And so we started doing some of our first trips over to Capitol Hill to do briefings on, there's this proposal to cut the State Department by like 30% and other things like this. And so I'm riding in these vans, like in the back of these vans with all these State Department, officials. They didn't know I was a political appointee. And the things that they were saying, but just blatantly scheming to subvert the Trump administration agenda. Like, here's how we can signal to Congress we're going to work with them against Trump on stopping stuff. And I'm just sitting there, I was like, wow, okay, the deep state is real, and it's just right here riding in this van with me over to Congress.
Yeah, which is remarkable to me when defenders of the deep state on the radical left say, give me one example of what the deep state is. Talk to any political appointee of a conservative administration, and they give you scores of stories. In fact, someone who will remain nameless because he was in a senior position in the Trump administration, but a good friend of mine has told me the story of a couple of times where he's a senior official in this agency and couldn't get some of his paperwork past his own executive assistant.
Wow.
And that's when he realized, the way to confront the deep state is to be really focused as an individual on every step of the process. And so he literally would walk the sheet of paper, the memo that was very important on policy at the president's directive from one office to the next in order to get the sign-offs. I emphasize this point because this is what we're up against on the political right. And it isn't even a liberal or conservative thing. The motivation isn't. It's the proper order of this country.
Right.
That the executive branch reflect the directives of the president of the United States because he's been duly elected by the people of the United States.
That's exactly
It's what our founders intended.
That's actually constitutional. I've been thinking about if Trump wins again, I hope he does. I pray he does. The screeching we will hear if he actually begins to do some executive branch reform, reforming civil service, working to make sure that these people who serve him as the duly elected chief executive implement his agenda, they will call it unconstitutional. They will screech and they will cry. And yet it's actually the most constitutional thing he could be doing. And it's what we should expect. And it's the way I've thought about it is the gears of Washington, D.C. and this bureaucracy, they just sort of continue to grind on in a progressive direction. And when we elect a Democrat, it works well with them. But when you put a Republican on top of that and he's trying to go in an opposite way, there's so much friction. And that's not how it's supposed to be. So there's a lot of work to do there.
We could spend an entire episode or more talking about this, but in fact, we're going to talk about something even more important than that, and that's the intersection of faith and politics. But actually, all of this is connected because the existence of this overreaching Leviathan known as the administrative state has something to do with the weakness of other institutions in American life. Sometimes, William, I'm going to go all historian on you.
Great.
And it's just my nature and my training. And what I see is that the most important reason that the administrative state has grown as big as it is that Congress has abdicated its responsibility to legislate. Whole bunch of reasons for that. But the second most important, I would argue, tell me what you think, is that especially when you get outside Washington, what social scientists would call the American institutional life, the importance of little and big institutions from well-known universities to small colleges to Rotary clubs, all of that has deteriorated over the last couple of generations. And while those institutions serve a more important purpose than being a check on government power, one of the purposes they serve in a very informal way is to help diffuse power across the country. And faith is part of that because some of the institutions that have become weaker are institutions of faith.
Yeah, that's right. I think as sort of we've had a decline in the robust nature of faith in America, a decline of the family. So these little institutions, church, family, sort of even extended families living together, right? That's not really happening so much anymore in America. The government is kind of a both end. The government is stepping in and sort of playing the role of the nanny state, right? And one of the ways that we could work to push back on the government is to help revitalize these organic institutions that exist, of course, not only in America, but in every country that we need: family, church, civil society.
Yeah, these are Burke's little platoons.
That's right.
And we need those little platoons to be revitalized. So related, but sort of a transition to a separate topic, you leave the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
And then fairly recently, you started this Center for Baptist Leadership.
That's right.
What is that?
Yeah. So the Center.
Remember, I'm a papist.
That's
so
right.
You got to like start at a kindergarten level for me.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so as we were just hearing today, I think we had a Jew, Yoram Hazony, and two different varieties of Protestants up on the stage there
at the National
Conservative Conference, Douglas Wilson and Albert Mohler. America was founded as a Protestant Christian nation. We obviously have a lot of Catholics here, but that is, I think many of us Protestants argue rightly that that's historically our heritage, and yet Protestants are largely underrepresented at like elite institutional levels in America for our size. The largest Protestant denomination in America is the Southern Baptist Convention. We have about 13 to 14 million Southern Baptists, 46,000 churches, I think. And so it is a major institution, a big institution in American life for faith and for conservative values as well. And it was really during 2016 when Trump was running the first time, and we had this guy, Russell Moore, who was running our Southern Baptist lobbying arm, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. And this guy, he was a never Trumper, and it just seemed so discordant with what I thought. Actually, I think most Baptists support Trump, and 83% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. And so this guy clearly doesn't represent it. I started noticing this elite shift towards progressivism from leading Christian and Protestant figures. And that sort of put a rock in my shoe, you could say. And so when I got out of the Trump administration, actually, I went to seminary and got my Masters of Divinity because I thought we really need to help American Christians think better about the intersection of faith and politics and what it means to really like live out our faith and embrace policies that are good for America. And so the natural outworking of that has been, after I finished my time in seminary, launching the Center for Baptist Leadership, which is, and you're going to love this, I think one of the best ways to understand it, it's like a House Freedom Caucus for the Southern Baptist Convention.
That's a terrific analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're kind of an accountability partner.
That's right. We have sort of three main lines of effort. We want to revitalize the Southern Baptist Convention from within. We want to make sure it stays true to its theological commitments, our Baptist particulars. They won't be the same as Catholics. They won't be the same as
America.
Yeah, as Presbyterians. So we have Baptist commitments. We want to hold to those. We want to hold to conservative theology, believing the Bible is the Word of God and all that. And then the second line of work is defend it from those who seek its destruction. And when I say that, people's ears might perk up. What do you mean? Do people want to destroy the Southern Baptist Convention? To which I say, yes, they do, including people like George Soros and Open Society organizations. They have been funneling money into evangelical organizations, including Southern Baptist entities, to move them to the left, to affect the voting bloc in America. And there are other people too, just the secularists, the Marxists, that want to destroy us. And the third is to be a better Baptist voice in the public square. We're going to try to fill that role that's been missing.
Well, we're gonna dive into each of those, and you sort of previewed what I think will be a partial answer to my follow-up question, which is going to be the proverbial devil's advocate question.
Sure.
And you know me well enough to know that I take great pride in asking devil's advocate questions all the time, and also enjoy when people ask them of me, as I think you have. But the devil's advocate question is, why should someone who is not a member of the Southern Baptist Convention care, particularly if they're not a person of faith or, much faith at all? I mean, I can say that I care because you and I are friends. I think the Southern Baptist Convention is a very important institution, period.
Yes.
It's definitely an important pillar for those of us who are serious people of faith. But I think that maybe there could be some Americans, even those who are in this audience, maybe conservatives who say, I'm not sure this is something I really need to track. what would you say to them?
Sure. So I'll take that. I'll start with the general Christian who's not a Baptist. Then we'll go to the conservative who's maybe not a person of faith. And so, again, as Yoram Hazony was saying today, American revivalism has to begin with the Protestants, right? So we need evangelicals, and Catholics. There's a lot of Catholics in America too. So, but we need the evangelicals to step up and work for revival, renewal, and reform in America. And so, whatever your persuasion, whatever denomination you are as a Christian, you should want healthy, strong, and conservative Christian denominations of all kinds. So you should care about this, and then you should care about it because what happens in the Southern Baptist Convention impacts other denominations.
It's extraordinarily influential.
We're the big elephant in the room. So people look at us and it's like, oh, the Southern Baptists, they're going to have women pastors now. So maybe we'll have women pastors now too, right? Or things like that. Or they're going to be LGBT affirming. So maybe we'll be LGBT affirming too. And so it does impact these other denominations. So if you're not a Baptist, you care because what happens to Baptists impacts all Christians in America. If you're not a person of faith, again, you should care because you should want to live in a free and virtuous society. And as history shows us, free and virtuous societies must be grounded in transcendental truths and the moral order. As Christians, we believe that moral order, the natural law, is given to us by God. It's revealed even in nature. But it's essentially going to be, you can be free in a Christian country as a non-Christian, or you can be under the jackboot of communism or some woke Marxism. And so you should want Christians to succeed for your own sake.
Going back to that point, that in the absence of healthy institutions generally, but then precisely the absence of a sufficient number of healthy institutions of faith, whether it's the Southern Baptist Convention or another faith, is going to allow some other force to fill the vacuum.
Yes.
And as you've probably heard me say this, I'm a historian, not a physicist. But I often will use laws of physics and apply them informally to politics and civics. And one of them that I will often refer to is that it really is an issue of matter and of force. That if there isn't sufficient force or momentum happening and an institution becomes inert, it will be acted upon.
Yes.
And when enough of those institutions become inert and are acted upon, the forces that are acting upon them are more likely to be forces that are bad.
Yes.
Bad not just for really devout Christians, but bad for anyone who values a free society. And you cited one of those major networks, actually is the major network of nefarious ends, and it's the Soros network that has been particularly involved in undermining the great work of the Southern Baptist Convention.
That's right. Yeah, no, and it's just not even, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's not
This is just fact.
It's not QAnon. It's all out there publicly. They are anti-God. And then I think that makes them fundamentally anti-human. Humans are made in the image of God, and they want to see secular progressivism, Marxism flourish, and they recognize rightly that conservatives and people of faith are the greatest obstacle to that. The long march through the institutions has been going on, and it's knocking on the door of the American church at every turn. And it's interesting, you talked about, if these institutions fail, the family or faith, something will replace it. And really what replaces it is politics. It's like we turn politics into this almost religious endeavor and effort, which, politics is really important, but it's a false God and therefore a terrible God. And so yes, the progressives, the Marxists are coming for our kids. They're also coming for our churches because they recognize that they are a strong line in the ground against them on this fight.
And you really see the truth of that statement, that in the absence of these institutions, but in the absence of religion generally, that politics can become a religion. You see the evidence of that this year. I mean, here we are sitting not just in a presidential election cycle, but one that seems pretty important for the future of the country. Probably everyone has been very important, but this one certainly seems near the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. And when the radical left disagrees, they disagree with the vigor that you would expect someone who's defending a religion.
Yes.
But as evidence of the fact that it isn't a religion, even though Christians, of course, are not perfect people, the toxicity of their rhetoric reminds us that it isn't a religion.
Right.
And it provides a preview into what life will be like if we continue down this road.
Yes.
And so let's inject some hopefulness here.
Okay.
If it's heartfelt.
Yeah.
Have you seen some early offerings from or fruit from your work that suggest that we might in fact be able to either reclaim institutions or prevent some institutions that are under attack from being co-opted by the left?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that people are waking up to the fact that we live in a time where we need to do institutional recapture work. And that's something that I don't think many people had on their radar, maybe for the last decade or so. I was having a conversation with Ed Corrigan about the work that I'm doing. He was saying we should have been doing this decades ago. I was like, you're right. But at
least we're doing it now.
We're doing it now. So at the Southern Baptist Convention's annual meeting this year, so we get together every year. It's one of the biggest Democratic gatherings in the world, and we do 12 to 15,000 Baptists voting on things. The Center for Baptist Leadership, in partnership with an organization called Founders Ministries, we had a lunch event, and this is our first event. We're a young organization. We had about 1,000 people there. And we had Megan Basham come, and she talked about the information that she has discovered as she's been writing this book, Shepherds for Sale. And I think getting the facts out, the facts on the targeted, funded subversion of the Southern Baptist Convention and other Christian institutions will wake people up and they'll want to fight. So that gives me hope, right? Here's the bad news. You're being subverted. Millions of dollars are coming in from, God-hating Marxists to stop you guys. But here's the good news. Now that you know this, you can do something about it. You can hold these people accountable. We elected a guy for president. So we elect a president every year at Southern Baptist, Clint Presley from North Carolina, and he makes very important appointments. And I'm hearing good news. It's sort of like staffing and administration. I'm hearing good news that he's looking for strong conservatives for those appointments. So that gives me hope. So great event. And, I think we've got a good new president now, and people are waking up and getting in the fight, and seeing somebody like Dr. Moeller, this major Southern Baptist figure at something like NatCon too. I think it sends a signal that we're in the fight, and that gives hope.
Yeah, Dr. Albert Moeller, who's become one of my friends since I became president of Heritage, was one of the early guests on this show. And I admire him so much because of his cheerfulness and his clarity about the truth and about America. But I mentioned that because another one of my favorite guests on this show was Philippa Stroud, who's close to national conservatism. She is a wonderful British friend. And she told me on a previous episode of this show, maybe 6 months ago, that there is a very important difference between Americans' attitude toward institutional recapture and British attitudes toward institutional recapture. And I never thought about this until she said it, but I have really been focused on this thought the last several months. She says that in Britain, there is a tradition, she would argue because of the long span of their history as a nation state, of people, conservatives, people on the center right, reclaiming and recapturing institutions every couple of generations, every half century or so. Whereas in the United States, probably because of the physical ability for most of our country's history to just up and move west, that we would actually just start new institutions. But it seems as if one of the things that's happening is that as the American Republic grows a little bit older, that those of us on the political right are thinking about not just starting new organizations like the Center for Baptist Leadership, but that we're doing so in order to either reclaim older institutions or at least influence them and prevent them from being recaptured. What do you think about that concept?
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's it made me think of something called the Turner thesis, which was about how manifest destiny and the closing of America.
That's a lot to do with the Turner thesis.
Yeah. And then where does the spirit go? Because so much of the American spirit was kind of funneled into, manifest destiny and moving across the continent. And then in many ways, it actually sort of turned into like an imperial spirit, and we went outward beyond our borders. And certainly we could have questions about that and how that's worked out. But Americans have always been pioneers. And so what do you do when everything's been pioneered? But I think you're right in that as we grow older, we realize that there's sort of, pioneer work to be done in existing institutions, particularly for their revitalization and for their refreshing of their mandate, of their mission, of their fidelity to what they're supposed to be doing, whether that's, Congress or the Heritage Foundation or the Southern Baptist Convention. Are they on mission? Are they fulfilling their mission, or have they become stale? Have they become calcified? Are they going in the wrong direction? And so, Center for Baptist Leadership is a new organization, but its purpose is to help make sure that this 160-year-old institution, the Southern Baptist Convention, stays faithful for the 21st century. That's actually sort of like our main tagline is cultivating courageous and uncompromising Baptist leadership for the 21st century.
Which is important, not just for Baptists, but for all Americans, as I think you've persuasively articulated. So let's talk about an even broader topic, and that is the intersection of faith and politics.
Sure.
There's a lot of commentary about this. Some of it, I think, very astute. Some of it from the radical left that I don't think is that astute, that faith, religion have no place in the American public square. And none other than President Obama, when he was president, basically intimated that. He didn't say that forcefully, but he intimated that people have a right to private worship.
Right.
Which is a way of saying, don't you be talking about faith in the public square.
Right.
How do you tackle that?
Well, I think it's fundamentally, which way do I want to tackle this from? It's ahistorical, right? That's not American, right? That is the opposite of certainly what our founding fathers envisioned. George Washington argued that the cultivation of religious duty was very important for patriotism. John Adams said that our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. And then even we're reminded today of Holy Trinity versus the United States, when the Supreme Court essentially argued that America had a Christian founding and has always been a Christian nation. And so the idea that Americans should keep one of the most important thing about them, their religious commitments, behind the closed doors of their places of worship or their private houses, it's un-American. And that's not at all certainly what the First Amendment was trying to get at either. And so, look, the reality too is, so that's sort of from a historical take. From a theological take, there will always be a God over the public square. It's just a question of which God. It actually reminds me of in Exodus, when Moses disappears on the mountain for a little too long. And so what do? They're like, they want a God, so they make a false god, a golden idol, and it's obviously it's wicked, it's rebellious, and so that's what we have right now. The idea, the myth of a neutral public square, I think, has been roundly debunked, and we see that we will either have the one true God reigning over the public square as mediated appropriately by a government, which is different from a church, or we're going to have the golden calf of transgenderism, preferred pronouns, Black Lives Matter, and why don't we throw in Hamas there at the same time?
Well, I was thinking earlier in our conversation about the example that Hamas, and perhaps even more pointedly, Americans protesting in favor of Hamas really serve as an example of what we're saying here, that it isn't just that politics replaces religion. It's that becomes insidious really, really quickly.
Yeah.
So look into your crystal ball, William. 10 years, 20 years down the road, what does success look like for your effort?
Yeah, so I think that success looks like what success looks like for us is making sure that the Southern Baptist Convention has sort of purged the subversive radicals that are amongst us, and they are amongst us right now. Even at one of our seminaries, so there are 6 Southern Baptist seminaries. One of them had an individual there talking about buying essentially climate indulgences for our carbon emissions or whatever. That's nonsense. Why are we talking about stuff like that as Southern Baptists? So we need to drive out the radicals that are subverting us. We need to sort of reshore our commitments to our theology, our doctrine, our conservative commitments as well. I want to see Southern Baptists rallied to become a strong force for American renewal. Southern Baptists have a distinctive. They're big on religious liberty, separation of church and state. That's great. But over time, it's turned in sort of escapist and pietism, where it's sort of they are keeping their faith out of the public square. And so I want to see this block of 13 to 14 million Southern Baptists rallied to work for national renewal in America. Are you familiar with Aaron Renn and his book, The Negative World?
Sure.
All right. Okay. So, I think that a renewed Southern Baptist convention could really help lead us out of the negative world. So that's sort of what I think success looks like for us.
So you sound pretty hopeful.
I'm very hopeful
about the American future, even though there are plenty of reasons, if we want to be despairing. So final question for you is in the category of something I try to do with each episode, which is to give audience some action items if they're looking for some. Mm-hmm. What kind of homework do you want to give the audience?
Well, sure. If you're listening to this and you're a Southern Baptist, you need to come to our annual meeting. It's a big thing. We don't get good representation of our churches at this annual gathering where we make all these policy decisions and doctrinal decisions. So
showing up is half the game.
Showing up, he who sits in the room controls the agenda, right? And so come to our annual meeting. Check us out at centerforbaptistleadership.org. There's a homework assignment. And I'd say get smart about what it means to be a Baptist and be active in the public square. Come out and fight for America.
And it seems that we could extrapolate that wonderful advice and say, as people in the audience often hear me say, be active in your institutions. Yes. Obviously, you've got a specific call here, and it is important for everyone in the United States, but also be active in your institutions, in your local community, at the state level. That actually is the best way in the long term to put Washington, D.C. back in its proper lane.
That's right. That's absolutely right. I want to say one more thing, too, while I'm here with you, is that success would look like we would folks like the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action would have a reliable partner in the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, somebody who's working for conservative values in America. And as I am all too familiar with, not undercutting conservative partners with sort of a lefty angle wrapped in Christianese here in Washington, D.C., which is kind of what you're getting right now.
That's a real disease here. Mm-hmm. And for us at the Heritage Enterprise, it's often a lonely walk in D.C. There are others out there, to be sure, and thank goodness for them, but that would be welcome to have some more troops in the battle. William Wolfe, this has been a great conversation. I look forward to having many more with you over the years, and we wish you great success. And most of all, thank you for your faithfulness and your cheerfulness in spite of some stormy times. I think we can also extrapolate that 5 or 10 years from now, you're going to be very successful.
Lord willing. Thank you.
Well, hopefully you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. There's great hopefulness, not only in William's work, but also in William's words. Take that to heart, regardless of where you go to church. If you go to church, obviously, I think it's a good idea that you do. I'm sure William agrees with that. Lean into the institutions that are important in your life, in your community, and we will succeed in taking this great country back. Take care in the meantime.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 10 million supporters of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, Tim Kennedy, and Joseph von Spakovsky. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.